The church bell rang out, its deep, sonorous toll echoing through the sleepy town. Heads turned in confusion as the unexpected chime shattered the Sunday morning silence. Everyone assumed the service had begun early until they spotted the culprit, Karen, the notoriously entitled town busybody, strolling away from the belfry with a satisfied smile. "What on earth is she doing?" whispered Mrs. Johnson to her neighbor, scandalized. The two elderly women watched in bewilderment as Karen sauntered down the street, humming a jaunty tune. For years, Karen had made it her mission to regulate every aspect of the community, from the flower arrangements in the town square to the volume of the school band's rehearsals. Now she had taken it upon herself to ring the church bells, simply because she felt like it. As the news spread, outrage rippled through the close-knit neighborhood. How dare she disrupt the sacred Sunday routine? Didn't she understand the importance of tradition and order? The pastor hurried out of the church, his brow furrowed in concern. "Karen, what on earth are you doing?" he demanded. "You've disrupted the entire service. People are very upset." Karen merely waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, don't be so dramatic, Reverend. I was just in a jolly mood and wanted to share the joy. Is that so wrong?" Her eyes twinkled with a hint of defiance. The pastor tried to reason with her, but Karen stubbornly refused to apologize or acknowledge her transgression. She insisted that she had every right to ring the bells, as a proud, tax-paying member of the community. The more the pastor pleaded, the more obstinate she became. Tensions escalated as a growing crowd gathered, fuming at Karen's blatant disregard for their customs and feelings. Some parishioners even threatened to withhold their donations, while others demanded that the police be called. The situation was quickly spiraling out of control. Sensing the impending confrontation, Karen suddenly changed tactics. She plastered on a sweet, innocent smile and turned to the crowd. "I had no idea my actions would cause such an uproar," she said in a syrupy tone. "I was simply trying to spread a little joy on this fine morning. Surely there's no harm in that." Her words had the desired effect. Several of the more soft-hearted townspeople instantly felt guilty for their harsh reactions. Karen seized the opportunity, launching into a long-winded monologue about the importance of community spirit and togetherness. "We should be celebrating our shared values, not tearing each other apart," she proclaimed, expertly manipulating the crowd's emotions. "I was only trying to bring a little brightness to your lives. Is that really so terrible?" As Karen's crocodile tears began to flow, the pastor and a few others found themselves wavering, unsure of how to respond. The tension in the air was palpable, the outcome uncertain. What would happen next? Just as the situation seemed to be reaching a breaking point, a lone voice rang out from the back of the crowd. "She's done it again, hasn't she?" All eyes turned to see Mabel, the town's resident curmudgeon, shouldering her way through the throng. The elderly woman's weathered face was etched with a deep scowl, her lips set in a thin, disapproving line. I knew it was only a matter of time before Karen pulled another one of her stunts, Mabel growled, jabbing an accusing finger at the offender. "She thinks she can do whatever she wants, without a single consequence." Karen's crocodile tears dried up instantly as she glared at her longtime rival. The two women had been at odds for years, their feud fueled by Karen's unrelenting sense of entitlement and Mabel's steadfast refusal to back down. "Really, Mabel, must you always be so negative?" Karen snapped, her saccharine tone evaporating. "I was simply trying to spread a little joy, but you just can't stand to see anyone else happy, can you?" Mabel scoffed. "Happy? You think disrupting our entire town's Sunday routine is happy? You're delusional, Karen. As usual, you've put your own selfish desires above everyone else's." The crowd murmured in agreement, the tide beginning to turn against Karen. Sensing her advantage slipping away, she desperately tried to regain control of the situation. "I don't know what you're all so upset about," she huffed, crossing her arms petulantly. "It's not like I burned down the church or anything. I just wanted to liven things up a bit. Is that really so terrible? Yes, it is. Several people shouted in unison, their frustration boiling over. The pastor stepped forward, his expression grave. Karen, I'm afraid I have no choice but to report your actions to the authorities. You've disrupted a sacred service and caused a major disturbance in the community. That simply cannot be overlooked. Karen's eyes widened in alarm. The authorities? But you can't do that. I'm a pillar of this community. Mabel let out a triumphant cackle. Well, looks like your little stunt has finally caught up with you, hasn't it? Maybe now you'll learn that you can't just do whatever you want without consequences. As the crowd closed in, Karen's confident facade began to crumble. She suddenly found herself cornered, her entitlement and manipulation tactics no longer effective. For once, she was facing the very real possibility of being held accountable for her actions. The tension in the air was palpable, the outcome uncertain. What would happen to Karen now? Karen's mind raced as she surveyed the growing crowd of angry townspeople. This was not how things were supposed to go. She was the untouchable queen bee of Maple Grove, respected and feared in equal measure. How dare these peasants defy her? Sensing the tide turning against her, Karen knew she needed to act fast. Desperately, she tried to regain control of the situation, unleashing a torrent of excuses and justifications. You can't do this to me, she cried, her voice rising in pitch. I'm the one who organizes the annual charity gala, the town picnic, the Christmas pageant. Without me, this entire community would fall apart. The crowd murmured, some wavering, but Mabel remained steadfast, her eyes narrowed in contempt. Oh, spare us the self-aggrandizing nonsense, Karen, the elderly woman spat. Just because you've managed to worm your way into every community event doesn't mean you own this town. We get along just fine without your meddling. Karen's face contorted with rage. How dare this withered old crone challenge her authority? Mustering her most imperious tone, she turned to the pastor. Reverend, surely you understand that I was only trying to bring a little joy to our dull, dreary lives, she pleaded. Surely you can see that my intentions were good, even if my methods were a bit unorthodox. The pastor hesitated, his brow furrowed in thought. Karen seized the opportunity, sensing weakness. Think of all the good I've done for this community, she pressed on, her voice dripping with false sincerity. The money I've raised, the events I've organized. Surely that counts for something. For a moment, the pastor seemed swayed, his resolve faltering. But then Mabel stepped forward, her weathered face twisted in a sneer. Good intentions? She scoffed. Since when has that ever mattered to you, Karen? You've been steamrolling over everyone in this town for years, all in the name of your precious community spirit. But we all know the truth. You just can't stand the thought of not being the center of attention. The crowd murmured in agreement, their anger reignited. Karen's face flushed with humiliation as she realized her manipulative tactics were no longer working. Panic set in as she desperately searched for a way out of this predicament. This is outrageous, she shrieked. I demand to speak to the mayor immediately. He'll straighten this whole mess out. But as Karen's wild eyes scanned the crowd, she realized with a sinking feeling that the mayor was nowhere to be seen. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. She was well and truly cornered, with no one left to rescue her from the consequences of her actions. As the gravity of her situation sank in, Karen felt a wave of pure terror wash over her. For the first time in her life, she was facing real, tangible consequences for her entitled behavior. The thought of being held accountable, of having her power and influence stripped away, was utterly terrifying. Desperately, she scanned the crowd, searching for a sympathetic face, a potential ally who could rescue her from this predicament. But everywhere she looked, she saw only hardened expressions of contempt and indignation. Even the pastor, whom she had counted on to understand her good intentions, seemed resolute in his decision to report her actions to the authorities. Karen could practically feel the walls closing in around her, the noose of her own hubris tightening with each passing moment. In a final, desperate bid for salvation, she turned to the one person she knew could sway the tide in her favor, Mayor Weston. Surely the town's most influential leader would see reason and intervene on her behalf. "Mayor Weston," she cried, her voice shrill with panic. "Thank goodness you're here. These dreadful people are trying to have me arrested for simply ringing the church bells. You have to do something." But as Karen's eyes frantically searched the crowd, she was met with only silence and the occasional pitying glance. The mayor was nowhere to be seen, leaving her utterly alone and vulnerable. Realization dawned on Karen's face, her expression morphing from one of frantic desperation to sheer horror. The mayor, her steadfast ally and longtime accomplice in the town's power plays, had abandoned her. "No," she whispered, the word barely audible as the full weight of her predicament crashed down upon her. Mabel, sensing Karen's vulnerability, stepped forward, her gnarled finger pointing accusingly. "That's right, Karen," the old woman spat, her voice dripping with vindictive glee. "Your precious Mayor Weston is nowhere to be found. Looks like even he's had enough of your entitled nonsense." Karen's knees buckled, and she sank to the ground, her once pristine designer dress pooling around her like the tattered remnants of her shattered pride. Tears streamed down her face, her carefully cultivated facade of superiority crumbling to dust. The crowd watched in stunned silence, unsure of how to react to this sudden and dramatic downfall of their once untouchable queen bee. Even the pastor seemed taken aback by the intensity of Karen's emotional collapse, his expression softening with a hint of pity. But Mabel remained unmoved, her eyes narrowed in triumph. She had waited years for this moment, and she savored every second of Karen's humiliation. "Well, well, look who's finally been knocked off her high horse," the old woman taunted, her voice laced with a cruel satisfaction. "Guess your little game is up, isn't it, Karen?" As the reality of her situation sank in, Karen buried her face in her hands, her entire body racked with gut-wrenching sobs. For the first time in her life, the once powerful and manipulative woman found herself utterly powerless, her sense of entitlement and impunity shattered beyond repair. As Karen's cries echoed through the silent streets, a heavy pall fell over the gathered crowd. Even Mabel, the town's resident curmudgeon, seemed taken aback by the sheer intensity of the woman's emotional collapse. For years, Karen had reigned supreme, her iron grip on the community's social and political landscape unchallenged. But now, her carefully crafted facade of invincibility had been utterly shattered, leaving her exposed and vulnerable in a way no one had ever witnessed. The pastor, his expression a mixture of pity and uncertainty, approached Karen cautiously, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Karen, I know this must be difficult for you," he began, his voice soft and measured. "But you have to understand the gravity of what you've done. Disrupting a sacred service, causing such a disturbance. It's simply unacceptable, no matter your intentions." Karen's head snapped up, her reddened eyes glaring at the pastor with a mixture of fear and defiance. "Unacceptable," she spat, her voice raw from crying. "I'll have you know that I've been the backbone of this community for decades. Without me, this entire town would crumble." The pastor sighed, shaking his head slowly. "That may be true, Karen, but that doesn't give you the right to act with such disregard for others. Your actions have consequences, and I'm afraid I can no longer overlook them." Mabel, sensing an opportunity to further undermine Karen's crumbling authority, stepped forward, her bony finger pointed accusingly. "Oh, save it, Reverend," she sneered. "We all know Karen's good intentions are nothing but a facade. She spent years manipulating and bullying everyone in this town to get her way. And now, finally, she's facing the consequences of her actions." The crowd murmured in agreement, the tide of public opinion firmly turning against Karen. She looked around frantically, desperately searching for a lifeline, but found none. "This can't be happening," she whispered, her voice trembling. I'm the most important person in this town. You can't do this to me. Mabel let out a harsh, mirthless laugh. Can't do this to you? Oh, my dear Karen, that's where you're wrong. We can, and we will. Because you're not as untouchable as you thought, are you? Karen's face crumpled, and she buried her head in her hands once more, her body shaking with sobs. The crowd watched, transfixed, as the once formidable woman unraveled before their eyes. In that moment, the true nature of Karen's character was laid bare. She was not the pillar of the community she had so desperately tried to portray, but rather a deeply insecure, entitled individual whose sense of self-worth was inextricably tied to her perceived status and influence. And now, with that foundation crumbling, Karen was left to confront the harsh reality of her own actions, and the possibility that she might finally be held accountable for them. As Karen's sobs echoed through the silent streets, the crowd watched in a mixture of shock and grim satisfaction. For years, they had borne witness to her entitled behavior, her unrelenting need to control every aspect of their community. And now, finally, the tables had turned. Mabel, the town's resident curmudgeon, stepped forward, her weathered face twisted in a triumphant sneer. Well, well, look who's finally been knocked off her high horse, the old woman taunted, her voice dripping with vindictive glee. Guess your little game is up, isn't it, Karen? Karen's head snapped up, her reddened eyes glaring at Mabel with a mixture of fear and hatred. This isn't over, you old hag, she spat, her voice trembling. I'll make sure you and every last one of these ingrates pay for this. Mabel merely chuckled, unfazed by Karen's empty threats. Oh, I don't think so, my dear. You see, the whole town's turned against you. And without your precious mayor to bail you out, you're all alone. The crowd murmured in agreement, the anger and resentment they had long harbored towards Karen now bubbling to the surface. She's right. You know, one of the parishioners spoke up, his voice laced with a hint of satisfaction. We've put up with your entitled behavior for far too long, Karen. It's time you face the consequences of your actions. Karen's face contorted with rage, her carefully crafted mask of control slipping away. Consequences, she shrieked, her voice rising in pitch. I'll show you all what real consequences look like. I'll make sure you all lose your jobs, your homes, your... But before she could finish her tirade, the pastor stepped forward, his expression grave. That's enough, Karen, he said, his voice firm. Your threats and intimidation tactics won't work here. I'm afraid I have no choice but to call the authorities and have you removed from the premises. Karen's eyes widened in horror, the realization that her power and influence had finally been stripped away, hitting her like a ton of bricks. No, you can't do this, she cried, her voice laced with desperation. I'm the most important person in this town. You can't just... But her words were cut off as two police officers emerged from the crowd, their expressions stern. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to come with us, one of the officers said, his voice brooking no argument. Karen's face drained of color, the full weight of her predicament finally dawning on her. Trembling, she allowed the officers to lead her away, her once proud stride reduced to a shambling shuffle. As the crowd watched her disappear, a collective sigh of relief swept through the gathered townspeople. For years, they had lived under the shadow of Karen's tyranny, and now, at long last, they had glimpsed a future free from her oppressive grip. But the question remained, what would become of the once untouchable Queen Bee of Maple Grove? As the police car carrying a defeated Karen disappeared down the street, an eerie silence settled over the crowd. The once bustling town square felt strangely empty, as if the very air had been drained of its energy. Mabel, the town's resident curmudgeon, stood at the center of the group, her weathered face etched with a triumphant grin. For years, she had been the lone voice of dissent against Karen's tyrannical reign, her endless crusade against the self-proclaimed Queen Bee of Maple Grove. And now, after all this time, she had finally witnessed the woman's downfall. But as the initial euphoria of Karen's humiliation began to fade, a nagging sense of unease crept into Mabel's mind. She had spent so much time and energy fighting against Karen that she had never truly considered what life in Maple Grove would be like without her. And now, with the once formidable woman reduced to a crumbling, powerless figure, Mabel found herself at a loss. The pastor, sensing the shift in the crowd's mood, stepped forward, his expression somber. "I know this has been a trying day for all of us," he began, his voice measured and soothing. "But as difficult as it may be, we must remember that even in the face of adversity, we are a community, and that means standing together, not tearing each other apart." His words were met with a smattering of murmurs, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably. Mabel, in particular, looked distinctly uncomfortable, her eyes narrowed in suspicion. "Community?" she scoffed, her voice dripping with disdain. "Don't give me that nonsense, Reverend. We all know that without Karen running roughshod over us, this town is going to fall apart." The pastor sighed, his expression weary. "That may be true, Mabel, but it doesn't have to be that way. We have an opportunity here to build something better, something stronger, but only if we work together." Mabel opened her mouth to retort, but before she could, a familiar voice rang out from the back of the crowd. "The pastor's right, you know," a young woman named Sarah said, her tone measured and thoughtful. "Maybe this is a chance for us to reclaim our community, to create something that truly reflects the values we all hold dear." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Mabel found herself uncharacteristically at a loss for words. For years, she had been the lone voice of dissent, the one person willing to stand up to Karen's tyranny. But now, with the tables turned, she wasn't sure what her role was supposed to be. As the townspeople began to drift away, some exchanging cautious smiles, others deep in conversation, Mabel stood rooted to the spot, her mind racing. Had she won the battle, only to lose the war? And what did the future hold for Maple Grove without its self-appointed queen? As the sun began to set over Maple Grove, casting long shadows across the quiet streets, Karen sat alone in her dimly lit living room, a glass of expensive whiskey clutched in her trembling hands. The events of the day had shaken her to the core, shattering the carefully constructed facade of power and control that had long defined her existence. She had always been the undisputed queen of this town, her word law, her influence unquestioned. But now, that once impenetrable fortress had been reduced to rubble, leaving her feeling lost, exposed, and utterly powerless. Staring into the amber liquid, Karen's mind raced, replaying the humiliation of her downfall over and over again. The jeering crowd, the damning words of Mabel and the pastor, the cold, unyielding grip of the police officers. It was all too much to bear. "How dare they?" she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "How dare they do this to me? I'm the most important person in this town." But even as the words left her lips, Karen knew they rang hollow. The truth was, her self-proclaimed importance had crumbled to dust, the foundation of her entitlement exposed as little more than an illusion. Desperate for a way to regain her lost power, Karen's mind grasped at straws, plotting, and scheming. Perhaps she could bribe the mayor or threaten the pastor. Maybe she could even buy off the police officers. Anything to restore her position and silence those who had dared to defy her. But as the minutes ticked by, Karen's frantic plans began to unravel. She realized, with a sinking feeling, that her well of influence had run dry. The mayor, her longtime ally, had abandoned her, and the townsfolk, once cowed by her manipulations, had found the courage to stand up to her. Suddenly, the weight of her isolation hit her like a ton of bricks. For the first time in her life, Karen was truly, utterly alone. A once untouchable queen reduced to a powerless pawn, her every move scrutinized and condemned. As she stared into the empty glass, Karen felt a shiver of fear run down her spine. What would become of her now? Without her wealth, her status, and her influence, who was she? The thought was almost too terrifying to contemplate. Slowly, Karen rose from her chair, her limbs heavy with a sense of dread. She knew she couldn't hide in the safety of her home forever. Sooner or later, she would have to face the consequences of her actions, to confront the world she had so ruthlessly shaped, and perhaps to discover the person she had become buried beneath the layers of entitlement and control. Taking a deep breath, Karen stepped out into the night, unsure of what the future held, but determined to reclaim the power she had so carelessly squandered.